Welcome, everybody. I hope day 2 of the Collaborative is treating you well. My name is Sean Chisholm, and I have the pleasure of introducing our panel today that's on the next generation of leadership in the social sector. We've compiled quite the all-star cast here for you, and we'll have an opportunity for you to interact with them and ask questions, so I hope you get a lot out of the session. So moderating our session with us, we have Jennifer Aronson, who's the Associate Vice President for Programs with the Boston Foundation. Next to her, we have Jacob Harold, who's the CEO of Guidestar. Lisa Jackson, who is the co-founder and managing director of the College for Social Innovation. And finally, James Halliday, board chair of the Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy. Give him a big hand.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here. I'm going to start by providing a few framing thoughts for the conversation, and then we'll dive right in, and we're leaving plenty of time at the end for questions and comments, so we'll be sure to get to that as well. So for some time, we've been hearing about a nonprofit sector-wide transition of leaders driven by shifting demographics, and this shift is often framed as a crisis due to the perceived lack of a strong talent pipeline. What's received less attention is that in addition to nonprofit staff and board members turning over in big numbers, so too are the stewards of the country's resources, including philanthropic resources. And this is important because with this massive generational wealth transfer, we see an accelerated focus on impact measurement by Gen X and millennial donors. And that in turn necessitates increased use of data and technology by nonprofits. And yet, even as nonprofit leaders and tools are evolving, the underlying causes of many of our greatest challenges remain largely the same today as they were over 100 years ago when the Boston Foundation was founded. And relatedly, also virtually unchanged, are the gender and race of the vast majority of these institutions' leaders. So given this, the opportunity for us all is to capitalize on this fresh energy, the promise of this moment, without repeating past mistakes, even as we work to meet many of the same challenges our predecessors faced 100 years ago. So how do we do this? A few months ago, the Boston Foundation released a report that included a couple of helpful recommendations, and I'll share 2 of them. The first is to use leader transitions as a catalyst to explore other options for organizational structure, including mergers. And the idea here is not mergers for merger's sake, but that they would better position organizations for mission delivery and sustainability. And by the way, it's not just mergers, it's also restructuring, collaboration, et cetera. Second is developing an organizational talent lens that prioritizes greater diversity and inclusion for staff and board leadership. So we'll now hear from these great 3 professionals to my left that are leading the way in how the nonprofit sector thinks about and invests in talent and knowledge. So first, I will turn to you, Lisa. After many years as a funder, you recently started a nonprofit focused on developing and diversifying change makers in the social sector and beyond. Can you describe the College for Social Innovation and why you started it?
Thank you, Jennifer. It's nice to be up here with some old and new friends. And it's really cool to have come a bit full circle. Actually started in the direct service world of the nonprofit sector, moved to philanthropy, and I'm now back. The College for Social Innovation's mission is about educating and inspiring the next generation of problem solvers. There's no shortage of problems. There's no shortage of social challenges that we face in this world. And we need people who can do that kind of problem solving really well. It's not an aha, pretty obvious. The question is, how do we get there from here? We aren't there now because we continue to have lots of problems we have yet to solve. So there's plenty of work to do, and we need really great people to do it. So the way that we have chosen to take on this issue is to tap into the 9 million undergraduate students who are hanging out in colleges trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives. And as we know, most college students these days, if you ask them on a survey, will tell you they want to lead a life of purpose. They want to create change. They want to do good. And yet, if they go knocking on the door of their career services office, no one is able to tell them, how exactly do I get a job doing good? If I have the luck, fortune, and money, I might be able to start my own business. But frankly, to Jennifer's earlier point, I'm not sure we need any more businesses. I think we actually need more people doing the work within a lot of the existing structures we have. So what we have done is say to colleges, you want your students to have an experiential learning opportunity, yes, and they say yes. And we say, but you can't do that well, can you? And they say no. And we say, well, how about we offer that to your students? It supports your mission of getting your students graduated and also well prepared for a world of work. And it gives us a chance to really build the talent pipeline for the sector. And so what we're looking for is a bigger, better, and more diverse talent pipeline for the sector to pull from. And so students come right now, we're in our about to start our second year of providing this opportunity for students. They come to Boston. They live with us in Boston. They are mentored in a social sector organization, whether that's a government organization, a nonprofit, direct service, or a social mission business. They learn how to work. They take classes with us so that they learn how to understand social problems and how to solve them, and how to use data to do it more effectively. And they also build a community of problem solvers amongst themselves and leave with a network that gets them jobs and internships either while they're still in college or when they graduate. So that's what we do, and in our experience so far, this is a place where if we could finally get to thoughtful, intentional talent strategy in our sector, we want to be ready to feed it with all of these great, talented people who are ready to change the world. That's what we do.
Great, thank you. James, you are the board chair of Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, known as EPIP. Can you describe EPIP and the important role it plays in the sector as both a professional learning and networking organization, as well as a champion for social justice and equity?
Yeah, sure. Lisa, it's great to hear that you talk about the idea of a talent pipeline and building pathways into careers in the social sector. And I think a lot of what EPIP does, the Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, is create the network and opportunities for young folks who are entering into that professional space. So EPIP's been around about 15 years. I'm based in San Diego. I'm the board chair of the chapter there. So as a chapter-based organization, we're spread across the country, about 1,000 members in total. And with a mission to build a just, equitable, and sustainable society. And to do that, it's really engaging with folks who are in typically their first 10 years or so in the philanthropic space, so working in foundations, or are themselves aspiring philanthropists, roughly in that 25 to 40 years of age range. So we've got a specific focus on social equity, racial justice, through the national conferences and professional development opportunities that we offer. Those themes are really at the heart of the programming that we do in each city throughout the chapter. And I think some of the sort of the depths of those topics will come out as we have our conversation today.
Cool, thank you. So Jacob, Lisa, and James have just spoken about the importance of supporting and leveraging diverse talent. And of course, the other part of this dynamic picture is the great generational wealth transfer that I mentioned, and the use of data and technology to steward these resources. So could you speak to Guidestar's role in this landscape and the potential if those with resources are better connected to data and information?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me start by talking about zeros. So when we talk about the intergenerational wealth transfer that we're beginning here in the United States, estimates range, but they tend to be over $30 trillion. So that's a 3 followed by 13 zeros. There's a lot. We're talking about a whole lot of zeros here, right? An immense amount of the capital of American society that's shifting hands. And then as we think about how that's shifting, it's shifting to a set of people who have a different set of expectations for how they make decisions. Speaking from my own experience, I'm in the midst of trying to buy a house for the first time. I've never done that before. And when you look at the resources of Trulia or Zillow or Redfin, The way that my wife and I are able to make this decision is so profoundly different than it was a couple decades ago. And essentially, I think society is becoming spoiled, potentially in a very good way, that when they're making a hard decision, whether it is, where am I going to send my kid to school, or what house am I going to buy, or where am I going to give my charitable dollars, that decision can be enriched by data. And that there can be a sense of agency on the part of the donor that is really magnified by that data. And so that's the role that Guidestar is seeking to play, is to enable, during that transfer and during the broader evolution of the nonprofit community, a kind of decision-making that wrestles with something which isn't too popular these days, which is nuance. But I think we can do it. I've got faith that humanity can wrestle with nuance. And so Guidestar has 8 million users and then 209 platforms, including Facebook, Fidelity, Amazon, Schwab, Vanguard, and others that use our data on their platforms. And this creates an opportunity for nonprofit organizations to ensure that they're plugged into that flow of information, which is going to be so important to this 3 followed by 13 zeros and its transition over the next couple of decades, which is to say that 138,000 nonprofits have come to Guidestar and updated their profile so as to share more accurate, up-to-date, and more multidimensional information that goes beyond just tax forms. And that, we believe, can position nonprofits to be a part of this much richer kind of decision-making that I think is now becoming the assumption of how we operate in the modern world.
Great, thank you. I want to pick up on something, Lisa, that you said about developing a bigger, better talent pipeline, and contrast that with a recent report that a few of us up here have read, and I encourage everyone out there to read who cares about race equity in the workplace, and it's called Race to Lead by the Building Movement Project, and it talks about the discrepancies by race of employment, particularly in the social sector, and power at the board and the staff level, and so on. And so one of the things that the report does is talk about the organizational responsibility to be part of that picture, right? We often hear, oh, I tried to recruit a staff person of color, but there's no one out there, or there's no one available that meets my needs, right? All these sorts of excuses. And so I'd love to start, Lisa, and definitely James and Jacob, please jump in, about how you think about the balance as someone who runs an organization between developing the pipeline, right, which by definition is sort of, we need to develop the individuals who create the pipeline, and then what part of that responsibility does the organization hold from a management, recruitment, retention point of view?
So it's really interesting when you talk to nonprofits about their challenges with their talent pipeline. If you sort of say, what do you struggle with when you go out to hire people for your organization? And we did some initial sort of conversations with folks, and lots of people said, no, it's actually big enough. There are plenty of people out there. Many of them said we can actually find pretty talented people. To your point, the thing they could not do is find or develop a pool of diverse people to choose from who were also great and plentiful. One of the interesting things we've learned is that in college, one of the ways that students have access to jobs and internships is that they participate in things known as high impact opportunities while they're in college, okay? So they work with a professor, they study abroad, they do a research project, they go on an unpaid internship because their parents can support them to do that. But most students of color, low income, and first generation students cannot do that. And so what we end up doing in college is actually increasing our inequity around access to success, because we don't actually provide that as a normal part of their post-secondary experience. And most nonprofits, when they're hiring, are also looking for college-educated kids. So you still need your college degree. And so as we've thought about this, one of the things we've had to do is really be intentional on our program side that was where we started, was like, okay, on our program side, 60% of our cohort will be represented by students across those 3 groups I mentioned, students of color, low income, first generation. And we have to work really hard with colleges to over-recruit and to be very targeted, right? Because to your point, they say, well, where are they? They don't show up, they don't volunteer, they don't want to do it, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, you actually have to go find them. Well, the same thing is true for us as an organization. And we partner with host organizations, nonprofits, and social mission businesses and government that are struggling. And one of the things we say to them is, here's the deal. You actually have to be intentional and do the work to find the people. And we will help you experience what it's like to have an intern who comes from one of these diverse backgrounds you're trying to fill in your organization. But then guess what? That person's now in your network. That person is now access for you that you might not have had before to grow your talent pipeline to become more diverse. And we do the same thing on our end. So we're actually in the middle of hiring right now. And you know, we have to get over this sense of like, in every nonprofit I've been to, you start to have these conversations and people say, well, we can't actually intentionally hire somebody because they're black or because they're a woman or because, and it's like, okay, can we not have that conversation? Can we have the conversation that assumes that we hire incredibly talented people, period, who are competent and capable to do the job, and then yes, actually we do need to hire a black person, and yes, we do need to hire a Latina, and yes, we do need to hire somebody who is 50 years older than everybody else in the organization. And just be honest about that and intentional. And I think once you do that, you start to open up like, oh, I know somebody like that. Like, you start to think about your network a little bit differently. You stop having a pity party and you get all about what you're trying to accomplish as an organization. And so we spend a lot of time in our organization ourselves talking about that because we want our passion and sort of commitment to this to show up amongst our team. But we also work with our nonprofit partners to figure out how to support them doing it as well. Because a lot of people don't have a lot of practice and a lot of people don't have a lot of tools, and you actually have to help people get there. So that's some of what we do and talk about.
So this notion of social capital that I think you're addressing, I think is really fundamentally connected to, I think, the question that philanthropy is asking about how does it strengthen democracy? Mm-hmm. And I think when we're talking about this talent pipeline and asking the question, like when I was in university, the idea of a career in philanthropy, or maybe more broadly a career in civil society, wasn't obvious. Like there are majors and there are careers that you've heard of. You sort of get into a career, and I think more often than not, sort of haphazardly find yourself working in civil society and potentially in a foundation. But in thinking about then the transitions in leadership, and I think this, and also the wealth transfer, I think about sort of at the first level, we're building organizational capacity and we're building leadership development. But by extension, I think what we're growing is civic capacity, civic engagement, and especially with this young generation, to whom this great wealth, this abstract $30 trillion is coming over the next 3 or 4 decades, that there are historic levels of whether it's political apathy or disengagement from the political process. So by investing now in the organizational capacity of foundations and civil society, you are by extension investing in civic engagement and ultimately the body politic.
And I'd like to add that it's also important to think about what's the frame that we bring to this topic in terms of why are we doing this? Because there really are 2 reasons why this is important, in my mind. One is sort of fundamentally an ethical reason. This is the right thing to do to address historical inequality. But there's another reason, which is you just get better when you have a diverse team. You're simply more effective. I mean, the research is very clear about this. And so, I think at times we can end up in a frame which is sort of a guilt-driven frame. And guilt can be useful. I mean, guilt is important.
Yes, it is.
But there's another frame which is very positive, which is just we are going to be more effective. And actually, maybe we're going to have more fun, too, if we actually invest in ensuring that we have a diverse staff across multiple different axes of identity. And so I think the more that we're able to build beyond, or go beyond a kind of a position of defensiveness to a position of excitement, we're more likely to be successful. I'll give just one place where this touches what I was talking about earlier, which is the flow of data. So it's important to understand nonprofits, I would argue. If you want to understand nonprofit, you understand the diversity of its staff and board. So we've started collecting that data at Guidestar, and we've collected it from about 10,000 nonprofits. and across 4 different axes of identity. And there are many different axes of identity: race, gender. We also collected around sexual orientation and disability status. You mentioned age. Age is an incredibly important dynamic that I think we need to track: socioeconomic status, et cetera. But we've been very intentional to not frame it as share data that will show that you're not diverse and people will say you are bad. Instead, it's let's share data that shows the truth and have a conversation about that. And so I just think that there's a lot that we can do in terms of our framing that's very generative and exciting, and that ultimately will get us to a place that's both strategically better but also ethically better.
Do you mind if I jump in? So I just want to go back to something you said about how fun it is, and how I'm making the assumption that all of you already know that it makes for better decision making to have diverse teams. If not, there are lots of books you can read to convince you, so I won't do that. But the fun part is the part that I want to kind of poke at a little bit, because the other reality of actually doing this is that it's harder. It's actually a lot easier from a human being standpoint to work with somebody who is just like you, because they agree with you, they think like you, they know how to do everything you know how to do. It's easy. Having this experience just this year from an incredibly richly diverse team, it's wicked hard to do this well and to not have people leave because they feel like you're not doing it well. So I think this also points to a need in our sector to get really honest about the work it takes to do it. You don't just hire a bunch of people and throw them together and say, good luck, hope the diversity thing works out for you. You actually have to support people's own ability to work with difference, and we all have different levels of ability to work with difference. And so, to this broader issue of developing a talent pipeline and developing leadership, this sector has got to figure out how to do better by way of the kinds of professional development we need to support the end game, right? Because if we just sort of do it and then it fails, we think, oh, well, we did it and it didn't work, when in fact we haven't supported ourselves well enough, and we owe it to ourselves and the work we do to do that to be successful. So I just want to, it is a lot of fun and it's a lot of work, and we need to support ourselves to be really good at it, so.
Great. So I will carry that theme of it's a lot of work forward, because essentially I think part of underlying why it's a lot of work is we're disrupting what makes us comfortable, as you said. And shifting from this question that I'd like to come back to, and maybe Q&A we will, around the critical importance from a performance and from a moral imperative standpoint of having diversity and all of the things that means, and speak about the organizational entity itself, the structure, the nonprofit structure, because one of the things that we know, particularly now, is that while nonprofits are key to social change, they're by no means the exclusive lever by which social progress is achieved. And so when we think and talk about change leadership, we need to look beyond these individual nonprofit organizations and to a lot of things that you all have been talking about here for days and probably years and will into the future: cross-sector partnership, powerful citizen-led movements, this idea of a collective impact mindset. So I'd love to ask all of you, I'll throw this out to all of you, if you could talk about the specific skills that are needed in this new paradigm, either generally and or within your own organizations. Because one of the things that's interesting about this panel is that the developmental phase that each of these organizations are in at this moment. So College for Social Innovation, essentially a startup. Guidestar, I don't know how long. 23 years has been around. Jacob came in a few years ago and is kind of, bringing it up to date, and it's a new day. EPIP is a network. How long have you? I should have done this research.
15 years at the national
15 years, okay. And then Boston Foundation, 100 years. So different structures, different phases of growth. So just want to talk for a minute about how that impacts ability to have social impact. Throw it out to anyone.
Sure, happy to start. I definitely want to surface two themes in answering this question. One is power and the other is privilege, that are really baked into any conversation about philanthropy. And so, in talking about power, I would say as a specific skill or set of skills, power mapping is vital in this. And so, each EPIP chapter is a volunteer organization. I mean, there are members that are part of it in the city, but in the programming we provide, I think keeping the issue of power at the center of the conversation and its dimensions, and some of we talked about in terms of whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's age, whether it's the funder-recipient relationship, many dimensions of power, and there are others that I didn't mention. So I'd say power and privilege mapping and the exercises that relate to that are really essential tools that I think some organizations use well and can certainly be scaled more broadly.
I'll offer a couple of initial thoughts. One is, and it gets very much to something Jennifer was talking about, this range of the age of different organizations. And there is a perhaps unfounded, but probably empirically justified belief that millennials who are engaged in social change are proportionally more likely to start new organizations. And yet, as we have a leadership transition, there's going to be a very interesting opportunity for millennials and Gen Xers to take over existing organizations, some of which might be 100 years old. And that requires a different approach because you aren't able to start from scratch. And I will speak from experience that it is awesome to not start from scratch sometimes because you have assets you can work with and build upon. But it means you have to figure out how do you honor the past of an organization while also helping it evolve as it moves into the future. So one thing that I hope to see is more clamoring among young leaders, and young in terms of age, but also in terms of number of years in the sector. You could be 65 years old, having spent your career in the private sector, ready to come into the nonprofit sector. I'd sure like you to take over some organizations that are a little sleepy instead of starting something new. So there's just an extraordinary opportunity there. And because of the fact that there are some generational differences in terms of perception of questions of race and power, use of data, I think that could, if we're thoughtful about it, work to the advantage of the field. The second thing I'll note is just what strategic frameworks we bring to solving social problems. I'll take design thinking is totally awesome, right? But it's kind of annoying when people only see the world through design thinking. Behavioral economics, totally awesome. But when people only see the world through behavioral economics, it's limiting. Or straightforward mathematical modeling, totally awesome, but not the only way. Storytelling, community organizing, there's complex systems theory. There are so many different frameworks that enrich our intellectual tool set to make a better world. But I think a challenge for leaders going forward is an ability to move among those different tools to be able to find the one that's most appropriate for solving a given challenge. That's a really interesting challenge, but it's a hard one too, because it requires us to have the ability to sometimes hold contradictory ideas in our heads. But I mean, that's part of what leadership is about, and I think I'm hopeful that we can collectively figure out how to do that.
This is why I waited to go last. So I guess I want to go back to part of your question, which was about structures, and sort of how do we think about the different kinds of possibilities and structures to do what we do well, and then what's the connection between that and leadership. And I think, people come into our organization, millennials, looking for a flat organization, or they'll say, you're too hierarchical, or they'll use these words to sort of define what they perceive to be the structure. But I think, and then you have leaders who've been in the sector for a really long time, who really do only have one frame for how something can be structured, and they'll tell you that it's worked really well for them, right? I think part of the opportunity we have now, particularly when you think about bringing in new leadership, is how to revisit whether you have aligned appropriately the structure to the mission. And whether or not in doing that, you've answered the question about sustainability. Because I think right now, it's almost too easy to start an organization without giving that any thought, and then you sort of go for 10 years and you're doing really good work, and then you look at what you've built and you're like, maybe this wasn't the best. Oh, there's 10 of us down the street. We could partner with them. Like, we oftentimes just want to do the work and save the world, and we don't give ourselves permission to sort of ask these thorny questions and look at all the frameworks and consider the possibility that maybe I don't need an organization. Maybe I don't need a 501c3. Maybe I need 10 people who are working on this to work on this together and do it differently. Who knows what it might be? But you have to actually start with what are you trying to get to, right? And work yourself backwards to then what's the right structure. And there could be 10 structures. Maybe there's not just one. But I think that sometimes we don't do that work, and so by default we rely on whatever frame is our particular frame that we're stuck on. And I think we have a real opportunity to ask and answer and revisit that question. And then when we think about leaders, who's the right leader for that structure is an interesting question. And then when we throw in sustainability, because you don't just want to build something that, well, maybe you do, because maybe your problem's only a 5-year problem, but most of us are working on like 100-year problems. So if you want it to last a long time, why are you relying on philanthropy? Maybe you're relying on philanthropy because that is connected to how you've thought about how you're solving the problem, but it doesn't have to be. We have an earned revenue model, knock on wood, that when we get to 350 students, we will be, as we like to say, philanthropy optional. And then that allows philanthropy to work with us in very different ways than simply trying to keep us alive and keep us open. But we built that in from the beginning. Lots of organizations that have been around for a really long time, it's like, how would we even start that? But I think it's an important conversation as you then hand over leadership to somebody. Maybe we could open that up again and think a little differently about our structure or the frame we've been using, and then how do we think about that leader and that role, and what do we need in our talent pool across the team to make that happen? So lots of things came in my head as you were talking, but that's what I came to.
That's really great, and that's something I could talk about for a long time. And I will just make one comment, and then I promised Jess I would open it up to questions at 15 minutes, and we're at 15 minutes now. And the comment is, and then at the end I'll come back to each of you guys for a concluding thought after the Q&A, but is around marrying this notion of you don't always have to start something new to have really big impact, and in fact there's kind of an upside to it, and the idea that millennials, Gen Xers, this next generation isn't necessarily interested in inheriting the same organizations that are now available to run. And while we can think and talk and debate both sides of it, I think it's pretty evident that it's important to do both, right? To have organizations that adapt to the leadership, that listen to the leadership, that are ready to receive new leadership in all of the messiness and difficulty, and leaders to get that, right? To get that mindset. Not everything is new. There's a lot that exists that's really important, and that we need to work within. So with that, we would love to hear your thoughts, questions.
Hi guys, thank you very much. Whoa, was that me? It's really great to hear these perspectives. I'm a new entrant into philanthropy, I hope. And a couple of the things that you've been talking about really resonates with a struggle that I've been facing, which is how to have impact. And you've talked about partnering and having fewer organizations, maybe avoiding starting up new ones. As I think about the huge landscape of places where I can give money to, this idea of consolidation is very appealing to me, because the bigger the organization, perhaps the impact can be greater. And I struggle because I'll give you an example. I was in a meeting several years ago about trying to increase STEM, in high schools, and there must have been 300 organizations in the room, and this was just for the city of Boston. And I walked out of there thinking, how the heck are we going to get anything done? So I'd be curious about your thoughts going forward as I look out over the next 10 or 15 years. Is this something that we can count on happening, or is it, totally unrealistic?
I'll offer a few initial thoughts. I don't think we can count on consolidation happening. There are just simply different forces at play in the world of philanthropy in the nonprofit sector. And I also, while I am very much a fan of consolidation, Guidestar itself, we've acquired 3 small organizations and hope to do more in the future. It's also important to know that there are times when being small is an advantage. If your strategy, if your theory of change is deeply rooted in a particular place or community, you may be able to be more impactful per dollar as a small organization than you could be as a large one. But for other kinds of organizations, you need to be big. And I would say, in general, in the field, we have fallen a little bit too much on the small side of the line. But that is not to say that small is bad. It's that we need to match our model with our strategy. There are some things that I think give me some hope. I think the greater availability of information just makes it easier to find who are your potential partners in the field. How might you roll up your activities? There are more and more examples of nonprofits staying distinct, but combining their back-end operations. So you still get some operational economies of scale. There are a number of examples of successful mergers. Think about a giant merger of what is now a multi-billion-dollar community foundation in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I'm hopeful, but I think some of it is going to be attitudinal for us all to be thoughtful about the organizational structure as a means to an end. And so we just need to figure this out according to what creates the most impact. One other thing I'll say is that donors play a potentially very important but also tricky role in this. Because when a donor goes to two nonprofits and says, hey, you should merge, it doesn't really work very well. But when a donor goes to nonprofits and says, I really want to understand your economics and what you're struggling with, and hey, I'm going to introduce you to this other organization that has a similar set of problems, and oh, you're talking about merging, let me help figure out how to support that. That can be really powerful, but we have to be thoughtful about the power dynamic there too.
To this question, I'll just jump in as well. There's an opportunity and a need I want to just raise here, which is one, in any city, there are collaboratives of nonprofits already working in sector areas and subsectors, and STEM Ed is a great example. The STEM ecosystems that are across different cities is that network. You'll find, so the investment in the collaborative in a sector can be a great way to create the kind of efficiency and impact that you're looking for. However, and this is a learning, and a colleague of mine on the board at EPIP San Diego knows this very well, which is if you're not also investing in the added capacity that is an admin capacity to convene the leaders, thought leaders, action leaders within that collaborative to do whatever it is that collaborative is meant to do in aggregate, you're missing out. And you will come up, it'll be lesser than the sum of its parts if it's just, we want to fund a collaborative in San Diego's case, it's funders around homelessness, funders around mental health. Lots of organizations, small, medium, and large, coming together. So while you'll hear, I think a lot of noise about mergers and acquisitions, effectively in civil society, it is how to effectively fund collaboratives and that work that really gets to the heart, maybe, of your question.
I'm good.
Anything to add?
They did it.
I would also just add the Boston Foundation's was part of a funder collaborative 5-year experiment called the Catalyst Fund, where we funded mergers and collaborations, and I'm happy to talk to you about some of those lessons learned, but we'll echo what Jacob and James said, that the best way to become the most unpopular philanthropist in Boston is to try to do these forced marriages. So that's definitely a lesson. And one other is also to underlie what you just said, James. There's what we used to call at the Catalyst Fund, this collaboration math, which was somehow that 1 + 1 = 1, meaning that funders are always looking to stretch their dollars, right? Makes sense. They're limited dollars. There's enormous opportunity and challenges. But that somehow, if two organizations merge, you can fund them at the same cost that you used to fund one or the other, when in fact what we know is successful mergers are actually more expensive for the most part in the beginning, and may never realize cost savings. It's more about sustained or increased impact. So it's just a different mindset. I think it's an important question to be asking, but it's certainly not the only one. So other thoughts? This is great.
Hi, I'm Mark Baseman from Salesforce.org and a Bostonian, so hi to the Boston folks. I'm just wondering for this panel, do you think that the inherent structure of the 501c3, so the volunteer serving board, the relentless focus on programs to the exclusion of everything else, just limits proper investing in things like human capital and technology?
Yes. Well, I would say that it limits it only because we tend to rely on it as a way to do what we do. Like we fall back on it. We sort of, And we've created a sort of funky mythology about, well, I'm a 501c3, therefore blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, it's a tax code, and it means I have to do my taxes a certain way. It means I'm, obliged to a board. But other than that, it doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of what's possible out there for you. And I think from the donor's perspective and sort of giving, some of that's a framework question, right? Like if, the conversation in our sector slowly but surely is moving from one of charity to one of like mission businesses to social impact. Like we're trying to figure out how to like reframe that, and we continuously fall back on the charitable deduction or the charity conversation. And so I think it's a framework issue. I think it's a mindset issue. I think, but I do think it can get in the way of what we think we can do, because, and then we had this moment in time when everybody was comparing the nonprofit sector to the for-profit sector, and everybody got bent out of shape. And so now we can't talk about things like revenue. I taught a class recently on fundraising, and I was like, we're actually talking about revenue. And what they were talking about was grants. And I'm like, well, that's money, and you bring it in, so it's called revenue. But like, we still aren't there yet, because we keep falling into this tax code conversation, which we need to get past. So that's why I just said yes.
And let me just echo that and say, the institutional form is not the root of the problems. It is the mythos, it's the mythology around it that's the problem. And I would argue that, and you all are probably lucky that there's not a whiteboard because I'd want to draw this out, but there's really a continuum of market failures that you can map different social issues to. So certain social issues, it is possible to recover all of your costs. Like, workforce development, I think, is an interesting example because it's built into the existing structures of the market economy. There are other places where that's not possible at all. Think about a think tank. Think tanks are basically 100% reliant on donations. And then there's all sorts of stuff in between. In fact, the majority of the nonprofit sector, I think tends to fall in the sort of 40 to 80% of their costs covered by earned revenue, with the remainder being a subsidy. And that's a diversity of different social issues that we face that require a diversity of different business models, which makes total sense to me. So I think we need to sometimes celebrate the C3 model, sometimes celebrate the social business model, but also recognize there's a real mixture in between, and that's part of the puzzle that we as a field have to solve.
I want to quickly jump in as well, because this question really gets me going. So 501c3, just as I think Lisa said, just a tax code, not a business model. So that's one. Another element to, I think, thinking about 501c3s is that there's an understanding, and particularly I think for organizations that are they're active in community organizing, advocacy, that they have to be fundamentally nonpartisan. That means to not, and that is also a myth to be debunked, that there are a number of ways through strategic communications and partnerships in which there can be a political nature. It can have a public face. Positions can be advanced, right? The work of advocacy can be done through C3s and networks of C3s, which I think gets to the larger question of really, we spend a lot of time talking about C3s and not enough, I think, also talking about C4s and C6s. And what you're seeing, I think, as a larger phenomenon is the blurring of, I think, the lines, and especially around tax codes, from charitable giving to political giving. And so understanding C3, 4, and 6, and broadening the scope on this conversation is really essential in these times. And election times are as good as any time to think about that.
Yes. I think we have time for one more question or comment, and then I'm going to invite the panelists to share some concluding thoughts. I was told you guys were like an incredibly engaged group with lots of thoughts.
Bring it, y'all.
It's after lunch, they're all
It is after lunch, it's true.
So something I'm curious about is how the panel, as we think about the generational transition in leadership, around how you retain millennials in the public sector and in civil society careers, given that we're already seeing that sort of we as a generation tend to move around a lot more than previous generations, and with the understanding that there are a lot of these challenges to the business model that can make competitive compensation, good career path, and good investment in HR very difficult. So I'd be interested to hear the group's thoughts on how not only do you entice people into the sector, but then keep them there and sustain a career, not just sort of a stint.
Great question.
Well, so far, in my 2 years with this organization, I have found that to be really hard. So let me start there. And it's hard for a lot of reasons. Some of it goes to the structural kind of histories of organizations. Some of it goes to the fact that me and my co-founder are old relative to the people we hire, and what we bring as a frame and what the younger staff bring as a frame are oftentimes, not to mention other forms of diversity amongst frame that also get brought, right? So it's hard. I think one of the things that there's a couple of things. One thing that I have been resisting, and I'm going to continue to resist, is the notion that I have to create a talent strategy and an approach to hiring that is so focused on the generation coming in that I'm just busy trying to make sure they're happy. And the second I go down that path, I'm like in a deep hole, because their happiness and the mission of the organization are not always in sync. And so there's a real interesting, but you want your staff happy, because happy is they'll stay. But almost more importantly is they want to be a part of something that's amazing. And they want to feel like they've made a contribution in a real way, right? And so I think what's been interesting for us to think about is how do we create that space and opportunity and allow for everybody who is coming to that conversation to do the same thing. It's not just for the millennials. Everybody wants to be a part of something amazing, and everybody comes at that from a different way. And so in any organization, if you're gonna go for diverse talent, you're not gonna have everybody be just like you. You've gotta figure out how to be thinking about that all the time in terms of everybody's opportunity to do something amazing and to be a part of something amazing. I do think this issue, though, of how frequently people might move around is an interesting one, because I worked once for an organization where that was built in to the staffing model. There were jobs in which the expectation was somebody came out of college, they worked there for 2 years, and then they went and got their master's. You didn't stay. And that was the goal. And part of what they were trying to do was build people's skill sets so they could go on and do something else, not necessarily in the organization. And I think if we think more broadly about retention to the sector, not just retention to my organization, my most proud moments is when somebody leaves my organization, not this one necessarily, but ones I've worked in the past, and they've gone on to stay in the sector and do amazing things. And if I think about them as talent for the broader purpose, I have a slightly different investment, right? I might selfishly be trying to make sure they're really rocking it where they are, but I also need to be thinking about the next place you go, you're gonna need this set of skills, and so I need to invest some more time and energy in you, and not just kick you to the curb as you walk out the door, but really build you up so that you can become the executive director of the next organization you go to. It takes time, it takes intentionality, and it's hard, but I think we can do it if we put our minds to it, so.
So we are over time. I want to give James and Jacob the opportunity to also weigh in on this question and share a concluding thought, and Lisa also, if you have anything to add.
Just my concluding thought is for us all to stand up for nuance among business models, nuance among identity, nuance among leadership strategy, and that we're in a complex world, so let's find that nuance and try and enjoy that process, because I think that's where it gets really interesting. And that's where we get to see the real impact.
I'll just end with a friend of mine likes to use this quote, and I think he's borrowing it from the senator from the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the quote is, "If you're not at the table, you might be on the menu." And I would just ask you the question, who's at the table and who's not at the table? And to think about those voices that aren't represented at the table when you're making decisions, whether it's funding decisions and leadership decisions. And I'll leave you with that.
So my quick concluding thought is I hope the next conference I go to, I don't actually see a panel with this title on it. I hope that the next set of conferences, we're not talking about leadership development, and I hope eventually we put, and I adore Jeff Braddock, but that we put his report on the shelf about CEO succession, and what we're talking about instead is a much more nuanced, complicated conversation of how we get to impact in a way that is fully explicit about the role of talent, and that great people do great things, and if we focus on that, no matter what the tactic or the tool or the framework, we will just be so much farther than if we just continue to talk about whether or not you have a succession plan or whether or not you have the right number of people by head count in the room. So I'm looking forward and would encourage all of you to put those kinds of panels in your next conferences and lead us in those kinds of conversations.
And I would just thank the panel, thank all of you for your questions, your comments, your engagement. This stuff is really hard, just emphasizing what Lisa said, and I hope we all leave energized and recommitted to going forward together. So thank you.